Hey everybody, welcome back to our weekly podcast. My name is Patrick Tan, General Counsel for ChainArgos, the blockchain intelligence firm that brought you such hits as the Binance BUSD on backing. So with me, as usual, every week, our CEO and Chief Data Scientist, Jonathan Reiter. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for making us your podcast of choice for accurate information. We're going to talk about the USD0++. I don't want to say depegging because I don't think that was ever intended to be some kind of a stablecoin. People just treat it as such. So the USD0++ thing. HECO shutdown. Let's pour one out for the HECO blockchain. Ironically, we're one of the few people who cover the HECO blockchain because of some stablecoin funkiness in the early days, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that. And then finally, Sony's blockchain. That's right. Sony, the people who will give you the PlayStation, have a blockchain, and John's got all the latest deets on that and why that could be an issue moving forward, not just for Sony, but for, blockchains in general. So let's just talk about the usual dollar USD 0 plus USD 0 plus plus issue. You'll know if you follow our case studies that we did a case study some time ago about usual USD and the usual dollar and why it was an interesting approach towards what presumably is MiCA compliance, which is required ever since the 1st of January this year. So I'll just do a quick recap on that. But basically, usual USD0 is a stablecoin that does not pay any yield. And of course, MiCA, which is the European Union's...
It's a French-issued product,
Correct.
so it would fall under.
So it presumably would fall under MiCA regulations. So it's French entities, French founders. They have French everywhere. It's more French than a baguette. So they have USD0, which is a stablecoin that pays no interest. Fair enough. It's not exactly compliant in the sense that you have to do certain steps to make it compliant. And there are only certain entities can issue these things, but
it's a license. You have to get a license. They don't have a license. Yeah.
So, but if it was some kind of so anyway, no interest. And then there's USD0++, which is basically a staked version of USD0. And then with that one, it's just you take USD0, you stake it, you get USD0++, and then you get it's a non-rebasing yield token. And what that means is that basically you just get additional tokens and benefits and stuff like that for staking your USD0. Okay, so that's that. We're not going to talk about MiCA compliance. We're going to talk about the way it's structured and some basic finance.
So as we established previously, the main use of USD0 was staking to create USD0++. And we've written a little bit about how it looked like this was perhaps a quite clever, perhaps not clever, but just complicated regulatory arbitrage, finding a gap kind of thing, because MiCA does not allow interest payment, and then these products were indirectly affiliated. That's an approximate term, but and that again, the main use case, if you look at who uses the token, where the token goes, people were producing the non-interest bearing. So the token is backed by an interest bearing token, USYC. That's a hash note issue. That's the price accretes, so it's a non-rebasing money market fund. The price goes from 1.01, 1.02, whatever. Over time, it's up to 1.08 something. So it's accreted 8% of interest. That's got treasury bills in it, pays interest. If that's the backing for USD0, there's clearly interest somewhere that gets captured by something. And then that thing was USD0++, and then most of the USD0 went in there. So most people were, in fact, capturing that interest. You could imagine a situation where only a small fraction staked it, and then interest earned on the full amount was paid to a small group. And legitimately, that could be a very high rate of interest, right? So if you had a regulatory situation where only a quarter of users could stake for whatever reason, those people would be paid 4 times the interest on the underlying assets. That's not a comment about the arrangement being legal, not legal, compliant, not compliant. That's just sort of arithmetic on the yield, right? So you can actually see 20% headline yields there, and it's not necessarily crazy. Okay. Now, USD0++, as Patrick said, is a staked products. You stake your USD0 to get this interest. The interest is paid in the form of some other token. Details unimportant here. That staking mechanism was locking the tokens up for a couple of years. Right, 4 years was the initial setup, and the illiquidity of locking up your USD0 for 4 years should mean that, again, ignoring the interest component, the value of that thing should immediately drop, whether that's just because of discounting or some kind of liquidity premium or whatever. Right. If you put your USD0 in, you get a receipt, but you can't take them back out for a while. X any interest, that's clearly going to trade below USD0 you have in your hand right now. Now, there is, because they pay interest, the token, the receipt that gives you future access, but whatever the interest mechanism is, that price could be above, could be below. It depends on the interest rate. It's a floating thing. Although in general, assuming all the USD0 gets dumped into USD0 plus plus, the USYC interest is the thing funding in the first place, you'd expect that those kind of, offset. Okay. Now, the way the system was set up, you could unstake at 1-for-1 at the beginning. And this was documented as a short-term measure to bootstrap the system. Okay. Also, the planned eventual mechanism, the one that was brought in a few days ago, you could unstake, but there was a penalty for unstaking. You gave up some recent portion of accrued interest. So something like there's a break in your interest. Well, if the unstaking process is going to cost you some interest, right? In the simple, clean case where all the interest gets passed through, paid out, and it's locked up, but you're receiving the floating interest rate, you'd expect that to trade just below $1, right? Small discount. And then if there's an interest penalty for unstaking, it's going to trade lower. It's going to trade lower. What happened here was that they removed the 1-for-1 redemption mechanism for USD0 plus plus, and the price immediately moved down because it should trade below $1 if you don't have that additional feature to get the money back out. And it's locked up for several years with an interest penalty. And because people had lots of leveraged positions on this token in Morpho and other places, it dropped more than just the price difference would indicate, because leverage unwind prices normally drop. So what was happening here, right? If you could buy a token, you take a token that doesn't pay interest, swap it for a token that does pay interest at 1-for-1, you're going to want to loop that. You get the interest, convert it for tokens, stake them, loop, withdraw the interest. Because of course you are, right? A thing that pays interest and a thing that doesn't pay interest clearly aren't worth exactly the same amount. The version with the interest in it, everything else equal, it's got to be worth more money. So this is a sign to people that something is wrong to start with. That's why there were large leverage long positions put into them in here. Now, Morpho, which is also a French leveraged borrowing and lending, whatever, trading protocol, that got a lot of usual dollars in it, the Morpho protocol itself seemed to understand where the floor price for USD0 plus plus was going to be when this guarantee was removed. So the system didn't allow people, the collateral haircuts required for the leverage positioning were such that the protocol wouldn't lose any money. Right. But if you piled in a leverage long 2 days before this floor was removed, you still lost the 5%, 10%, the price gap down, multiplied by whatever the leverage on your position was. So it's an interesting situation where the protocol that was providing people with a sort of mispriced leverage long trading position knew how to protect itself, but the losses were still inflicted on users. Because if you went long this thing at 1, effectively not hoping for price appreciation, but for hoping to be paid interest, which you could collect effectively for free.
For free, yeah.
And then it gaps down by 5%, 10%. Unless you earned 5% of interest, it hasn't been around long enough to earn 5% of interest. Right?
Correct.
So everybody that entered into it at roughly 1 has got to be down money. That's just going to mean that the collateral that they posted, margin on the position, was taken from them, was liquidated in the vocabulary of the space. So it's fascinating because you shouldn't think that being long an interest-bearing stablecoin versus a non-interest-bearing stablecoin is just free money. There's clearly something wrong there. As long as they leave the 1-for-1 in there, it kind of is, but that's going to drain liquidity from the system in a way that's also a problem. So now there's no reason to actually lock the thing up because you unwind all the way back to USYC. That's just a treasury bill fund, and you can buy that, and then assuming no ridiculous movements in interest rates, the price will just accrete slowly up over time. There you go. Right. So we seem to have introduced unnecessary complexity here. Treasury bill funds are quite short dated. USYC's underlying fund is going to have an weighted average life of 30 days, 60 days, something like that. Not a 4-year staking period.
Correct.
So we've added some complexity to allow some ridiculous trading schemes, and then that complexity is blown up on us when the rug got pulled and people had a bunch of losses. So, maybe if it looks too good to be true, it's not.
The term liquid staking token should tell you everything that you need to know.
It's another variation of that problem where you're assuming that you can deposit the money, take a receipt, and then the money that's deposited is yours, plus the receipt's worth the same amount, and it's also yours. That
You have
guarantee,
the $1. You don't have.
Yeah.
You haven't magically created two.
If you try and risk the same dollar twice, someone's going to come and try to collect eventually, and then there's going to be a problem like this.
That's the dollar so nice you risked it twice.
There you go.
So, I mean, things you should look out for that don't really make sense. Liquid staking token, diet candy,
Okay, I mean, diet candy is a different situation. But yeah, this is actually more related to the liquid staking tokens than I think that people realize, in that it's a similar sort of guarantee.
It's a similar sort, yeah.
If you look at staked ETH versus ETH, and staked ETH's the one that earns the yield and ETH isn't, and sometimes when there's illiquidity in the market, staked ETH gaps down relative to ETH. This is another example of that kind of a situation.
Two things as differentiated as these two things are shouldn't be the same price. And even if they are the same price, they can't be the same price indefinitely because eventually people...
Well, you shouldn't bet on them being the same price.
Yeah. So, okay, that's fine. HECO Shutdown, please. This is a classic.
The Huobi Echo Chain. So this was set up
That's what HECO stands
years
for.
ago. Yeah, sorry. Huobi Echo Chain, back when HTX was called Huobi. Huobi had some HECO Peg tokens, which were similar to the old Binance Peg tokens. They were tokens Huobi had run and stablecoins wrapped themselves. There was activity. There's an HT, which was a Huobi token, all kinds of stuff. It was a blockchain, not a major blockchain, but there was action. There was volume. There was stablecoin volume. 2021, 2022. Fine. They had a hack. The exact details of the hack issue don't really matter, but there was a hack, and then there was a guarantee that they were hacked in late 2023, and then Justin Sun, who by that time had taken over HTX, Huobi renamed, whatever, charge of HECO Chain, that he would make good on all of the people's whatever losses or the money that was hacked out of it, user assets. The chain was pretty attached to the Huobi exchange, so generally speaking, if you were on the Huobi Echo chain, you did it via Huobi. Right? There wasn't a native bridge such as it is anywhere else, so the exchange kind of knew who most of the people were. Fine. That's they were in a position to make that guarantee. I don't mean financially, I mean mechanically. Right? Okay, so they announced vaguely at the time that everybody be made good, and then just went away for a while. A HTX token was deployed, so an upgrade of the HT token to an HTX token, and then it was announced much later on that the way that they would be redeeming, making good people's losses, they were going to shut down the chain. You were going to be able to deposit your tokens to specific designated addresses, and then you would be paid back not in kind. So if you had a HECO Peg token or a whatever particular token, you weren't going to get back that same token. You were going to get the equivalent value as of a snapshot date that, if I remember right, was in December of this year. But
last year. And
then there was a cap imposed on how big that would be. So you'd get points, and then the points were converted to HTX tokens, and there was a cap on how many points you could get. So there's a cap on how many HTX tokens you could get back. So it's not clear if this was a guarantee to make everybody good with a low cap. Right, there clearly are people who would have been over the cap. Probably there's losses there. It's not even clear who was really using this thing at this point. Anyway, people fled. But what's really interesting is that the blockchain's been shut down. So that somebody can shut the blockchain down makes it obvious that the blockchain was completely centralized, because that's how blockchains work. Right? Because there you go. So what we're going to bring up here is some very simple data. So this is blocks per day on the Huobi Echo chain. I forget if it was a 3-second, 4-second, 5-second, whatever. So you can see this is a reasonably stable, looking like 15, 16,000, 18,000 a day, whatever, blocks. And then the blocks per day sort of dropped. It had a fixed number of validators, but action has gone down and down and down. We've talked a few times about how the chain was dying. This is a pretty clear manifestation, not just of the chain dying, but the rate at which blocks are being pumped out is changing, because I guess fewer participants, fewer nodes, people disappearing, nobody caring, poor maintenance. It finally ends here. The last day, there's just nothing. And then this is transactions. So transactions is interesting to note because this is back in this is post-hack, but still kind of used before the announcement would be ending. This is kind of a dead period. And then this right here, this big spike, is January 9th, the last day that you could deposit your things to be redeemed in HTX tokens later was January 10th. These are in GMT. It was never clear what time zone and what the cutoffs would be exactly. I say that because we ran our node straight off the end, and it's not like it stopped at a fixed boundary. You can see still transactions that we have on the 16th. I think there's like 80 transactions. There you go. We still have some transactions in that. So these are token transfers, not native token transfers. The details don't really matter. But it's interesting to watch the way a chain dies. So this chain was sort of, whether the details of the hack are unimportant, whether this was a private key exploit, was an inside job, or hacking, it doesn't
really
make
matter.
a difference.
Yeah.
It was decided to end it, and then they announced a migration procedure for the tokens, again, weird or otherwise, and just shut the thing down. So that is an interesting acknowledgement of total control. It's not even the Frank Herbert generic like power to destroy a thing. Like the Dune quote is a theoretical thing. But if you announce you're going to turn something off and you're going to migrate all the user's assets, and then you provide a migration procedure and turn the thing off, then there's no question. Like you exercise total control over the thing. That's not the threat to destroy whatever the spice feels, I think, is the relevant threat.
The spice melange.
So it's interesting to see here. You don't normally see blockchains turned off. Terra had some weirdness following the collapse and turn off, turn back on, whatever. Terra, whether or not that had a central operator, the purported central operator didn't acknowledge they were a central operator in the same way. These guys have just owned it. So, owned it, morally, physically, mechanically, whatever. Owned it. So that's something, right? It's an interesting state of affairs. So there you go. It's the first time we've seen that happen, where it's just, I guess, cleanly finished. If you go to the Explorer page,
subjective.
Everything just sort of spins, and there's nothing coming up anymore. So,
it's interesting nonetheless, because I think before.
Oh, sorry, and it's a proof of authority chain, so
Correct.
you can't run this thing on your own. Only their 21 validators can do it, so it's dead.
Yeah. So and no chance of it coming back unless they decide that they want it to come back.
Yeah, because the keys are just not.
But it's interesting to look at, because when a lot of this stuff was started, nobody really knew what would happen if somebody stopped supporting the chain, because there was like so many chains coming out.
Well, and people would claim, HECO claimed to be decentralized. Right?
Oh yes, that's
that
true.
It's now mechanically impossible to run the chain without Huobi's support, HTX, whatever support, makes it clear that that was never true.
Yes.
I would note that Tron and many other chains have the same feature where Tron's, well, okay, I shouldn't say that. Tron is a little bit different, because if all of the major Tron nodes disappeared, it's probably the case that you could cobble together some people with some tokens and maybe run some validators.
Maybe.
Whereas here, it's a proper proof of authority chain, and there's no way without the keys for those nodes to do it.
So tell me about the Sony chain. What the hell
This
is
is
that?
beautiful. This is a different form of authority. Okay, so Sony, of electronics and entertainment fame,
Of PlayStation fame.
announced that they were going to. Is that their most famous product? Maybe the Walkman.
Well, the gamers.
Sony product. They announced that there would be a Sonium. It's a Optimism and OP stack ish. We'll come to that in a second. L2 on Ethereum. They had a test net, whatever, launch. So they launched this thing. They launched this blockchain. However, so it's a Soul Sequencer. It's this standard OP stack sort of chain thing that's out there at the moment. There's some kind of a proof procedure, but it's permissioned, and there's a Soul Sequencer, but there's permissionless access to deposit and withdraw. The contracts are upgradable by Sony. So it's this usual, like, in between. There is an operator, but they're not exercising any of the instruments of control over most of the system. Now, what Sony did that's interesting, so you can participate in the network, but you can't sequence the network. Their RPC nodes, so the nodes that people who are not running, so I guess I should be careful how I say nodes. So there are blockchain nodes, the things that actually run the network itself, that support some kind of a API for executing transactions and checking things. And then there are nodes that sort of, they're computers that just specialize in providing API access to the network, which are generally known as RPC nodes, that don't have to be the same as the underlying blockchain nodes. If you're running your own node, blockchain node participating in the network, you can process everything fine. You're running it with the right settings, whatever. Sony had some RPC access so people could use the system. So this is scaling access to the system beyond just the nodes themselves, because you can run a blockchain with this kind of a chain. You can run with a very small number of nodes, right? They may not be the ones you want to expose to the outside world for API access. They were censoring transactions coming through their RPC. So they were rejecting tokens they didn't like. The details of the tokens they don't like don't matter. They were exercising control via the RPC. Now, the RPC is not the native part of the network itself. So the sequencer wasn't rejecting these things. People discovered this. They were unhappy about this. Or maybe some of the optimism folks might have been happy in that. The next thing several people did was they submitted transactions they wanted forced onto the network via the interface on the Ethereum network, and were able to force them through. Right? So one of the things that optimism provides is a mechanism so that you can force inclusion of transactions on the L2. And this is intended to make it censorship resistant so you can't block. Now this is where things get interesting. Sony has said that they don't want these transactions. And they've said that by blocking them in their RPC. Right? So they've said it in the most direct way possible, which is don't allow these transactions. Then they've been forced through on the network. So Sony is now accepting, in some sense, processing transactions that are valid state transitions per the rules of the chain that they've said they don't want. So this kind of leaves us with two possibilities. Sony's either, I guess, kind of admitting it's doing stuff that's wrong. Now, whether they didn't want to do these, they said for business reasons or for legal reasons or whatever, we're not going to talk about here. We're just going to assume bad is a generic bad. So what can they do? Well, the first thing they can do is just continue processing them. It's kind of weird to block certain transactions in one way, but then process them in another way. Right? That's strange. I will note that you see a somewhat similar dichotomy on Ethereum and other networks, where there are people who will refuse to process transactions involving OFAC addresses. But if somebody else processes a transaction with an OFAC address, they'll still allow that to be in their chain history, because otherwise they'd have to fork every time. All right. So I'm just going to say that again in case that's somewhat confusing for people. You can say that your block builder, sequencer, whatever, your thing that submits the next block to a blockchain when it's your turn, won't accept transactions involving OFAC or other sorts of sanctioned addresses. And you can do that, and then you're never the one assembling transactions, appending to the system transactions with sanctioned addresses in them. But if it's another guy's turn to add a block, and they include something with the sanctioned address in it, you either accept that as part of the history and build on it, or you fork. That's what a fork is. Right? So Sony has the exact same problem here, but it's a little bit tighter because of the way the L1, L2 relationship is set up. Sony could refuse to accept these transactions. Right? Well, if Sony refuses to accept them, then their sequencer, the node software, whatever the rest of it, properly is no longer running Optimism, because stuff's rammed in using Optimism's forced transaction inclusion mechanism, and then blocking it anyway. Right? So you then have a situation where kind of the L1 and L2 forked-ish from each other. Right? Because of the way that the Soul Sequencer Optimism L2s are set up, it's not possible for somebody else to run the network. They need the keys to access the L1 address, which Sony has. Right? So you then just have like a somewhat disconnected L1, L2, which will kill the thing.
Yeah.
Right. So they can't really do that. So they're now in a situation where their choices are somehow accept in a weird way and process transactions and build upon transactions they don't like, which again is vaguely similar to the situation for all supposedly OFAC compliant block builders on Bitcoin and Ethereum and the rest of it. Or they can just effectively torch the whole thing. But they've put themselves in a very binary situation by trying to block these things in a way that doesn't work, right? So in a sort of physical defense kind of an analogy, they block the front door but not the back door, right? Or the side door is left open, the porch isn't locked, whatever. It is interesting, and maybe we'll eventually find out if this... I mean, there's a few reasons that can happen, right? One of them is that they're not actually really trying to block this. They're just trying to look like they're blocking it hard enough to achieve some legal objective. And that's fair enough. I suspect that given what happened, if that was their strategy, they're not happy with the results. That on day one, people tried jamming transactions through. But, you pays your money and you takes your chances. Another possible explanation is that they didn't realize this would happen, right? So... if the people who were setting it up, running it, deciding policy, whatever, didn't understand that you could jam stuff through on the L1. Because blocking it at the RPC level is weird.
Yeah.
Because even with a cursory understanding of how blockchain networks work, you'd think there's a consensus mechanism. Even if you don't know how any of that works, you know that the Nakamoto consent, there's a consensus mechanism.
Yeah.
You need to exclude transactions as a part of the consensus mechanism so everyone agrees they're not in the system.
Yeah.
Just blocking them in the RPC is the easiest thing from a software engineering perspective, almost certainly, right? I bet that you can trick their RPC into accepting these addresses by putting them through smart contracts in different forms. That's a separate conversation.
And we're not suggesting you do that.
Well, it'd be interesting if somebody tried, but that's an intellectual exercise. But blocking the RPC is easy because you can imagine the call, submit, transfer. You just have a list of destination addresses and ban them, right? That's not foolproof, but it's something. But that clearly won't work if you know. I'm not going to say anything about how optimism works, but a little bit about how optimism works. Optimism has made an attempt to be censorship resistant. They've tried harder than these guys tried to censor them. So I don't know what's going to happen, but Sony's a large company with a lot of lawyers, and clearly this strategy was signed off by the lawyers, and the lawyers can't be happy that it turns out it was ineffective, and they certainly can't be happy with whoever told them it would be effective, unless the whole thing wasn't necessarily supposed to be effective and it was a fig leaf, and then they just look not great, and we'll find out.
We'll find out. We'll see, but this is
going to be a problem.
This is going to be a problem,
Yeah.
and this is why you'll notice that financial institutions who understand these sort of things pretty well don't have this sort of blockchain, don't have these sort of L2s appended to a public L1.
This is not a permissioned system.
Yeah.
This is a permissionless system with some kind of halfway patchwork Band-Aid that doesn't really work. That's worse.
That goes down to your compliance impossibility paper.
I think, in general, you're going to struggle to do things this way. You have to do a hard block.
But again, and this is why, you might see companies like Sony, who isn't a financial, they have some financial services business, but they're not a financial institution per se. They make PlayStations. And you have JP Morgan and the other financial institutions who do have blockchains, but you'll notice they're heavily permissioned, all internal use. So
if this was permission, so if Sony had to allow people access to the system, this would not be an OP stack L2. This would just be a Sony network that's independent. And then somebody they permissioned published a bad token, they would at least know who was responsible for that.
Of course.
Right. Permissioning does not prevent bad behavior. It assigns responsibility for bad behavior.
Well, and also gives you the power to stop it.
You can revoke that permission.
Yeah, you can revoke that permission.
That won't undo what they did, but it'll stop it.
It'll
and then
stop
you do
any
whatever
future.
You do about that.
And that's why financial institutions don't do this.
In general. I'm hoping someday we find out what the discussion and Sony's goals really were here, because it's the strangest of all possible outcomes, where they tried not very well to block transactions they publicly said they didn't like, but they're stuck processing them anyway. No, it's not Sophie's choice.
All right. Anyway, on that
would
note,
be if they had to pick between two transactions.
All right.
Sorry, we shouldn't make jokes about that.
Okay. Anyway, on that note, thanks for tuning in, and thanks for all your likes, comments, and subscribes. We appreciate it, and the algorithm appreciates it. So if you would like more content like that, smash that subscribe button. We'll see you again next week. Have a great weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.